Hi, I'm Sam Meadows. I'm the Private Markets Healthcare Thematics Analyst here at UBS. I'm joined by Aaron Morris, CEO of PostEra. And we're going to talk all about the platform, some of the foundational technology used to discover some of the drugs in the pipeline, and then some of the exciting work you guys have been doing in women's health. Aaron, to get started, can you just tell us a little bit about what is PostEra, kind of what are the founding principles, and just give us a quick intro to the story.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Sam. So PostEra was founded back in 2018, 2019, really nucleated by a series of academic breakthroughs that my partners led in the University of Cambridge and become co-founders. And effectively, they were trying to solve several problems in machine learning for small molecule medicinal chemistry that they felt, and in fact, Pfizer and AstraZeneca, who partnered with them, felt was not well addressed by computational techniques at the time. A classic example of this is algorithms were great for dreaming up potential new small molecules, but had no idea how to actually synthesize and make them in a lab. There were a bunch of other breakthroughs, and effectively in 2018, 2019, we felt that we had enough to really make a dent in the machine learning landscape and formed PostEra, really building off that academic foundation. And so late 2019, we started the company in London. 2 months later, we were invited to Y Combinator, which is an accelerator in San Francisco, and overnight we became an American company, and the journey has continued in America since.
Very exciting. I've been really interested in kind of the evolution of some of these AI drug discovery platforms. You guys have your Proton platform. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of where in the drug discovery journey Proton kind of fits in and is kind of innovating?
Yeah, we describe developing a drug as starting out in biology. You're effectively trying to find which relevant biological targets are associated for a given disease. You move from biology into chemistry. Now you actually need to develop a therapeutic, traditionally an oral small molecule, against the target. And then finally, you go into medicine, which is I need to now run the tests in humans in clinical trials of whether this drug really does modulate this target and produce the desired effect. We do next to nothing in biology and next to nothing in the clinic. We have very much branded ourselves as being the world leader in the middle part, which is chemistry. And so within that chemistry domain, you can further break down the development of a small molecule into this design, make, test cycle. You design a molecule, you get it synthesized and made in a lab, you then test it in an experiment, you get the results back, and then you iterate over and over again. And the dream and the end goal is to arrive at what the industry calls a development candidate, which is basically where the chemistry stops. And that chemical structure is going to stay the same for the next 5-6 years until you go through trials and ultimately onto the shelves of a pharmacy. So Proton is very much there to be the industry-leading platform for that design, make, test flywheel, covering the complete end-to-end chemistry component of drug discovery.
Okay, so really innovating in that kind of iterative process of getting to DC. Have you given any measures around kind of how Proton is impacting that time to DC?
Yes, so people will generally bring up 3 metrics for whether the platform is doing anything useful. I would say number 1, the most important, however, the most difficult to quantify, is quality. At the end of the day, we want drugs that are going to fail less in the clinic. And so what we want is really high quality drug candidates that satisfy often very stringent, demanding target chemical profiles. So that's the one that our pharma partners want. It's what we judge ourselves on. Can we generate really high quality development candidates? The second, in terms of priority for us, is speed. How quickly can you go from 0 to development candidate? Typical industry timelines are like somewhere between 4 years, somewhere in that ballpark, and we're doing it in about 18 months. And then the final one is cost. Pharma doesn't really care about this. We don't care that much. But just to give you the stats, we're running about 60% faster and in fact 60% cheaper since we started compared to industry averages. Obviously quality, I can't quite put into a number, but I can give a bunch of case studies for why we think we've been able to demonstrate the value of the platform on producing higher quality drugs.
Yeah, and the platform has really been validated, to your point, by some of these pharma partnerships that you guys have. Can you just talk about a little bit, who you're partnered with, what do those partnerships entail, and Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So we have done 4 large pharma deals to date, 3 of them with Pfizer, who's been our longest collaborator and is now tripled down with us, and Amgen as a newer partner. And really, the deliverable is basically the same, which is give me a development candidate. And PostEra handles all of the chemistry. Sometimes we start with nothing. Sometimes our partners have begun some process of screening, and maybe there's some starting chemical matter. Maybe there's something in the literature out there that's a good starting point. Either way, we actually prefer to get in as early as possible and then drive these programs all the way to development candidate. And so our partners are giving us a pretty wide variety of different scientific challenges. I will say we very much still stick to small molecules. The recent deal that we signed with Pfizer, you will see in the headline, it was ADCs, but even there, PostEra is very much focused on the payload side, not the antibody side. So again, if it's small molecules, we can do it. And for the last 5-6 years, we've really helped these partners develop novel drug candidates against targets that are of high interest to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then, moving away from kind of the platform and into the pipeline, PostEra's kind of made this, I think, a really exciting choice to, invest in women's health and building out a pipeline for women's health indications. Can you talk about the rationale for choosing women's health as the vertical to kind of go after with the platform, and what is the lead asset that you guys have in development?
Yes, so much to say here, so let me try and be concise. We evaluated the entire landscape of therapeutic areas. There is nothing therapeutic area specific to proton. As long as it's small molecules, proton will do it. So when we said, hey, we're going to do an internal pipeline, where therapeutic area should we look at? We looked at everyone possible, and pretty much everybody else is doing oncology and I&I. It's all the same. I'm going to talk about everyone else, I really mean the AI biotechs. The AI biotechs, their pipeline pretty much looks a carbon copy of the industry at large. Heavy on oncology, heavy on I&I. So the first thing, yes, I like being contrarian and going after something very different. But in terms of why we initially got excited, number one, at a macro level, what we understand about the human body is really what we understand about the male human body. Women were not even included in clinical trials until 1993. When people talk about drug side effects, what they're typically referring to are male subjects in clinical trials and the side effects that they faced. And it wasn't really until 2014 where you had gender parity in clinical trials. So in a sense, we've really only had a good 10, 12 years of female physiological data in the clinic. So that is an exciting trend. Obviously, that data is not proprietary to us, but it says, okay, we can now divide patients by sex and gender and understand how drugs affect male versus female. So that's good. Second, when we think about fertility, parents are having kids later and later in life. So kids who may have been born typically when their parents are in the early 20s and now in the early 30s, IVF has increased by over 130% in the US alone. And I think as nations continue to get more wealthy and more developed, you will continue to see that trend of couples having kids later and later in life. So we think IVF will continue to be in high demand, and therefore the fertility solutions to that we think are really important to address. Thirdly, we are actually quite excited about the direct-to-consumer phenomenon that you're seeing in the industry, where the physician is no longer the center of the healthcare system, but actually the patient. And we think that the rise of telehealth platforms, what Hims and Hers and Roe and those have shown, is patients are willing to engage directly. And actually, we think a lot of the products that we are developing are actually really, really amenable to a type of direct-to-consumer market. And so we think that's going to massively enlarge the TAM over the course of the next several decades. And now scientifically, and I'll wrap with this, we want to pick our battles. We know our strength is chemistry, so we're not looking to take a huge amount of risk on the biology. We're looking for areas where there is some level of understanding. That can be genetic understanding, it can be the existence of biologics, for example, it can be clear mechanistic understanding of a pathway. So we're not going to pick out some new target no one's ever heard of. And secondly, along with good biology, we need big markets. Now, if you are looking for therapeutic areas with good biology and big markets, there's no free lunch in this industry, so the price you pay for that is the chemistry is exceptionally challenging. So if you contrast the type of target candidate profiles that we hold ourselves to compared to, for example, some oncology programs, we have to deal with much higher stringency on safety profiles, on margins, on low human dose. And these are difficult, but they are all chemistry challenges. And that's why we back ourselves to be able to do it better than anyone else. And so that characteristic of big market, good biology, hard chemistry really typifies women's health. That combined with that macro backdrop gave us the excitement about being contrarian and going after this area.
Yeah, so your lead asset is being developed for PCOS.
It is.
Can you talk a little bit about the target, if you can, and then how you're thinking about the actual market opportunity in PCOS?
Yep. So let me start by saying, polycystic ovary syndrome affects about 10 to 15% of all women globally who are of reproductive age. So that roughly translates to about 5 million women in the US. And pretty much everyone who watches this will have a mother, a sister, a niece, someone who has this condition. And there is no approved drug. There has never been an approved drug for PCOS, and we plan to be the first. Now, the actual condition, I just want to lay out what PCOS is, and I'll talk about our program. The name is actually not super helpful. So when people think of PCOS, they think cysts on the ovaries. Cysts on the ovaries are neither necessary nor sufficient to be diagnosed with PCOS. PCOS is quite heterogeneous, but there is a standard diagnostic criteria. You have to have 2 of 3, the menstrual irregularity, cysts on the ovaries, or excess androgens. And so what PostEra is targeting is that last core manifestation of PCOS, which is hyperandrogenism. So women effectively have elevated levels of testosterone in their system, and that manifests in a number of different ways. One of them is hirsutism. Women get excess hair growing all over their face and their body, acne, a lot of metabolic dysfunction. And so that for us is the real focus of what we want to address in PCOS, about 60 to 80% of PCOS patients. Now, we are going after an enzyme known as AKR1C3. AKR1C3 is responsible for ultimately the downstream conversion of testosterone precursors into testosterone, and it is overexpressed in PCOS patients. So if we can reduce the levels of or inhibit AKR1C3, then we can moderate those elevated levels of testosterone back to something that is baseline and more normal and healthy for women, and then ultimately relieve that clinical symptoms that I mentioned.
Nice. And then you mentioned earlier kind of this DTC angle. So would the idea eventually be to kind of go through a Roe or a Hims type platform and access women directly and really focus on targeting the hypersutism and some of the hyperandrogenic effects?
I think we would definitely look to have partnership conversation with telehealth platforms. Ultimately, we would still want physicians to be on board and to be prescribing this. But I think, yes, we do see a very clear angle for being able to engage women. The PCOS community is exceptionally well informed. They are ginormous patient advocacy groups, and they are exceptionally keen to enroll in trials. And so I do think there is enough information around the symptoms of PCOS and what our drug will do that I think it would be amenable to these kind of telehealth partnerships, as well as obviously the physician prescribed method.
Yeah, and then you mentioned there's no currently FDA-approved drugs specifically for PCOS. I know there's some patients will use metformin or other kind of metabolic-focused drugs that are not really targeting PCOS at its core, but more some of the symptoms.
Yeah.
Why has PCOS been an area we just haven't seen that much drug development? Is it challenging from a target perspective? Is the drug development path just not well defined? How do you think about that?
Kind of all the above. So
Okay.
Firstly, I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding. I think most people originally assume, PCOS is fertility. Fertility means clinical trials in pregnant women. That sounds scary. Let's not go there. And so I think what often gets missed is actually the predominant concern of women with PCOS is the androgen excess-related symptoms. The number one reason that women present to physicians is actually hirsutism and the hair growth. So I think firstly, there was just a misunderstanding of how we're going to treat this disease. I think secondly, yes, we have to lay down the regulatory pathway. We have to be super proactive with regulators, with patient advocacy groups, with payers, because we are laying down that gauntlet for the first time. And again, that's just a barrier to entry. if you can go after oncology or an I&I, something where there's clear precedent, I think that ease just encourages people to go to other areas. So I think there is both of those two things. And then thirdly, yes, the target is difficult to drug, or targets that are well precedented and that people believe in. And so I do think a challenge on the regulatory pathway, a misunderstanding of kind of what is the core patient need and what does PCOS mean, and thirdly, actually developing novel therapeutics has really combined to leave us with a pretty sad dearth of opportunities in PCOS.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then, just thinking about as this asset is entering the clinic, can you just talk about kind of some of the clinical milestones that people should be looking for and timing on any of those?
Yes, so we hope to enter the clinic next quarter, which is very exciting, and our asset is now the world's most advanced program against PCOS, which is both exciting and really depressing. And so for us, we obviously are trying to get as much input from all of these vicarious groups as possible. I think the first thing we want to really be able to show is, hey, we can bring testosterone down. And I think that is what we're going to aim to show in our first phase 1. We're going to have a patient cohort there and really try and show, hey, in PCOS women with elevated testosterone, we can bring that down to healthy baseline levels. Really then phase 2 is we show it translates into the registrational endpoints around hirsutism and hair growth. There'll be supportive endpoints as well beyond just the hair growth itself. And I think that for us lays the first kind of beachhead into that specific therapeutic area. Alongside that core primary endpoint, we will also be tracking metabolic factors as well, and also menstrual cycle factors. We really do believe that if you can manage that excess androgens back to a healthy baseline, you will not only improve the hirsutism, which is very much the tip of the iceberg, but you should improve the other symptoms as well. And so we really want to set ourselves up for label expansion when we hopefully have the first approval in the PCOS associated hirsutism.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the path seems pretty clear. Very exciting. You guys are entering the clinic next quarter. And then I know you guys have another asset in development in kind of reproductive endocrinology. Can you talk a little bit about where that program is and kind of where you're thinking about bringing it into the clinic?
Yes, so this is a very different program in women's health. We want to replace all injections in IVF with convenient oral pills. Very simple vision. Women, when going through IVF, often have to go through multiple cycles and a painstaking, no pun intended, painstaking level of injection burden. And if we can replace those injections with convenient oral pills that women can take at home, we think that massively increases the access and the convenience of IVF, and also potentially a safety benefit for a small subset of IVF patients as well. Now, this looks different from PCOS because here we do have a very clear approved therapeutic. It's the injectables. So now the challenge is, rather than being first in disease, you're now first in class, trying to disrupt the injectable market. And you have to be able to match what the injectable can do, obviously at a price point that is going to be reasonable. And again, the pharmacokinetics need to be acceptable. And so you are, again, really trying to push the standard of care now, not from the first ever approval, but trying to disrupt the only ever approval in the IVF space. There's been not much innovation for like 20, 30 years in IVF. So that particular program is a pair of programs. There's 2 sets of injections that women go through. There's the ovarian stimulation, and then the ovarian trigger from which the eggs are retrieved. So we're developing GPCR agonists for both the stimulation and both the trigger. So you need 2 to tango here. So half of the job is already done. We're in finished GLP talks. That program is ready to go, but we need the other half of the program to catch up, and that is in lead optimization. So the vision of all oral IVF is in lead optimization within PostEra. And yeah, we would love as we're on the next kind of 18 months to push that toward the clinic as well.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And just to contextualize, how should we think about how many IVF cycles? I know someone mentioned earlier today there were, I think, about 100,000 births in the last year from IVF, or the U.S. reached 100,000 births from IVF.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So there's about 435,000 IVF cycles done. So that probably like a 25% success rate, maybe higher, gets you to 100,000 births. That sounds about right, yeah.
Okay, nice. And then, we talked a little bit about you're entering the clinic soon. What other kind of milestones should someone watching the story over the next 18 to 24 months be thinking about?
Yeah, I think becoming a clinical stage AI biotech is a huge milestone for us. On the technology side, we, even in the last couple of months, have begun to roll out a agentic version of Proton to our scientists. So to date, our scientists, when using our AI platform, they're 10, 15, 20-year folks coming from pharma who want to have the latest state-of-the-art tools in their hands to do medchem and have a bit of that startup vibe as well. But they're on a platform and they're clicking buttons and they're running models and that's fine. We've got to a point now where the underlying large language models are good enough that you can actually begin to interact with Proton in natural English language. And so rather than running a set of models by buttons, you simply type into Proton, I want you to run ADME predictions, I want you to rank them, I want you to ensure that we have enough stock on hand of this molecule, and then effectively go get it synthesized if needed, and then run the assay. So that is a huge technological shift that is really changing the job description of what a scientist at PostEra does. And that is, for us, something that may be less in the press and less in the headlines, but is a drastically different way of being a scientist and doing drug discovery. So that's huge for us. I hope we can show some exciting progress on the pharma deals as well. We have 2 phenomenal collaborators, and we hope to be able to report additional milestones reached with them as well. So clinical stage, pharma deals progress, and technology development, trying to hopefully have good news across all 3.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Thank you so much for the time today. Really appreciate you telling us about the story, and thank you to everyone who is listening.